At Thanksgiving, my father announces he's selling the family business and that I'm getting nothing. My siblings celebrate. I calmly ask who the buyer is. He says a name, unaware that the company is actually mine. But before we continue, if you love stories like this, hit that subscribe button so you'll always be the first to know when a new one drops. Thanksgiving has always been a production in our family, a stage set for my father's grand gestures, and my siblings' relentless competition for his approval. That year, though, the tension humming in the air felt different, as if the walls themselves anticipated a spectacle. We were all gathered around the long oak dining table, a parade of steaming dishes between us, when my father cleared his throat with deliberate gravity. Every conversation died, all eyes flicking to him with a mixture of curiosity and, in my case, dread. I knew my father well enough to recognize that look, the smug assurance that whatever he was about to say would shift the axis of our world. He raised his wineglass, drawing out the silence, letting the suspense thicken, then announced in that familiar booming voice, "I have some important news about the family business." The words alone were enough to send a chill down my spine. My family's company, the one that had been the center of every fight, every dinner table debate, every anxious childhood dream, what could he possibly be planning now? He looked pointedly at me, as if savoring the moment, then delivered the blow. "We're selling it. The deal is done. And I want to be clear, some of you will get your fair share. But you?" He turned to me, voice dripping with condescension. "You're getting nothing." There it was, a life's worth of disappointment distilled into a single, humiliating public execution. My siblings gasped, then, in unison, broke into gleeful cheers, unable to hide their delight at my exclusion. Their eyes sparkled with vindication, as if the years of jabs, the whispered jokes behind my back, and the cold shoulders had finally found their perfect crescendo. I felt the world lurch beneath me, but years of practice kept my expression calm. My father's words echoed in my head, each syllable another brick in the wall he'd always tried to build between me and the family legacy. As I sat there, struggling to steady my breath and keep my composure, I knew the whole night would be burned into my memory forever. The smell of roast turkey and cinnamon pie, the clink of cutlery, the gloating faces across the table, it all became part of the moment my father decided to erase me, to cast me out once and for all. The humiliation was almost physical, like a weight settling on my chest. Still, I refused to give him or my siblings the satisfaction of seeing me break. The anger inside me was cold, controlled, and somewhere beneath it all, a strange flicker of anticipation was starting to grow. This wasn't the end he expected for me, and deep down, a part of me couldn't wait for what was about to happen next. Growing up in my family meant learning to live in the shadows. My father was always larger than life, impossible to please, quick to judge, and mercilessly competitive, even with his own children. From the time I could walk, it was clear I was never the child he'd hoped for. My siblings, Alex and Becca, fit the mold perfectly. Ambitious, loud, always chasing his approval, and willing to trample anyone who stood in their way. I, on the other hand, was quiet, observant, and to my father, perpetually too soft for the business world. Every dinner was a contest, every family trip, a battleground for who could impress him most. The business, Everhart and Sons, a name that always excluded the daughters, no matter how hard I worked, became both the family altar and my personal cage. As the years went by, I watched my ideas dismissed, my efforts undermined, and my loyalty rewarded only with criticism. My father would rhapsodize about Alex's negotiation skills and Becca's fearlessness, but when it came to me, his praise was reserved for being dependable or helpful, never visionary or ambitious, as if those words were off limits for me. The humiliation wasn't always public, but it was constant. I was the first to arrive and last to leave, covering for my siblings' mistakes only to watch them receive credit for my solutions. At family events, I was the odd one out, my contributions overshadowed, my successes reframed as lucky accidents. The expectation was clear: I would work, but I would never lead. My father openly mocked my decision to get an MBA, sneering that degrees don't build empires, guts do. He never saw the late nights I spent in the library, the networking events I attended alone, the small victories that kept me moving forward when it would have been easier to walk away. Through it all, the resentment built slowly, quietly, until it was woven into the fabric of my being. My siblings thrived on my father's favoritism, emboldened by his dismissive attitude toward me. Every time I tried to prove myself, the goalposts shifted. What counted as success for them was never quite enough for me. On my 30th birthday, my father didn't even call. Instead, he sent me a single email. "Hope you're making yourself useful." That was the year I realized I would never be enough for him, no matter how hard I tried. The family gatherings became rituals of humiliation. Each new announcement another reminder of how little I mattered. But as the years went by, something inside me hardened. I started keeping track of every slight, every missed opportunity, every time my siblings used me as a stepping stone. The more I was sidelined, the more determined I became to build something of my own, not out of spite, but out of survival. I learned to smile through the slights, to bite my tongue when my ideas were stolen, to let them believe they were winning. All the while, I was quietly plotting, gathering skills, making connections, and nurturing a resolve that none of them saw coming. The moment the announcement left my father's lips, my siblings erupted with a kind of glee that bordered on cruel. Alex's laughter was sharp and triumphant, echoing around the dining room as if he'd finally won some long-fought war. Becca, never one to hide her emotions, smirked openly, her eyes flashing with satisfaction as she clinked her glass with Alex's, toasting their sudden good fortune. "Guess you're finally out, little sis," she crowed, her tone sugary sweet and laced with mock sympathy. The rest of the family, uncles, aunts, even my cousins, shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some exchanging awkward glances, others quietly enjoying the show, no doubt relieved that the family drama had found a target that wasn't them. I could feel the heat rising in my cheeks, but I held my head high, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing me crumble. The humiliation was thick and suffocating, every giggle and sneer a reminder that, in their eyes, I'd always been disposable. My father sat at the head of the table, his expression smug, confident that he had orchestrated the perfect coup, removing the weak link from his precious empire. Alex leaned across the table, his voice just loud enough for everyone to hear. "Don't take it personally, sis. Business is business. You never really had the stomach for it anyway." Becca nodded, adding, "Maybe now you can finally do something more your speed. Yoga instructor? Or maybe a nice little arts and crafts shop?" Their words stung, but I refused to flinch. I could see their delight in my supposed defeat, the way they savored every barb and belittling comment. My mother, ever the peacekeeper, looked away, pretending to fuss with the mashed potatoes, unwilling or unable to intervene. For years, I'd watched my siblings jockey for position, throwing each other under the bus when it suited them, but nothing compared to the united front they showed now, basking in the glow of my exclusion. They saw my silence as weakness, not realizing that I was merely biding my time, letting them dig their own graves with every taunt. The air in the room was thick with tension and gloating, a toxic cocktail I'd grown all too familiar with. My father basked in their approval, raising his glass as if to toast the new order of things. "To family," he said, looking directly at me, the irony not lost on anyone. As the laughter died down, I glanced around the table at the faces that had once meant home, now twisted in varying degrees of triumph and pity. I realized in that moment that the family I'd spent my whole life trying to please was no family at all, at least not to me. Their celebration was just another performance, one last act in a drama that had always cast me as the outsider. But deep inside, beneath the humiliation and the anger, something else was stirring, a sense of resolve so powerful it almost brought a smile to my lips. Let them have their moment, I thought. They have no idea what's coming next. As the laughter and backhanded toasts faded, I realized that all eyes had shifted back to my father, who was clearly savoring every second of his victory. He was the kind of man who loved a captive audience, and nothing pleased him more than parading his power in front of those he believed to be beneath him. The room was tense, full of unspoken questions and silent gloating, but I refused to let their assumptions define the next move. Taking a slow breath to steady myself, I fixed my gaze on my father, careful to keep my tone neutral, even polite. "Dad," I said, my voice cutting clean through the noise. I'm just curious. Who's the lucky buyer? For a moment, the question seemed to throw him, as if he hadn't expected me to respond at all, let alone with such composure. Alex and Becca exchanged looks, smirking, probably imagining I was grasping at straws or too naive to understand how final this all was. My father, however, quickly regained his composure, straightening in his chair with a look of smug self-satisfaction. Funny you should ask, he replied, his eyes gleaming with pride. It's a major firm, Atlas Consortium. They're offering $30 million cash. It's already signed. He let the number hang in the air, as if daring me to challenge his wisdom, certain this announcement would cement his authority once and for all. The words were meant to wound, a reminder that while he'd chosen a future for the business, I was nothing more than an afterthought. The table buzzed with low murmurs. $30 million was more than anyone had ever guessed the company could fetch, and suddenly Alex and Becca were calculating their own windfalls, already picturing what their lives would look like with their shares in hand. I felt the weight of every eye in the room turn toward me, waiting for me to crack, to plead, or to lash out. But instead I smiled, small and knowing. Atlas Consortium, huh? I repeated, almost as if I were making a mental note for later. My siblings scoffed, misreading my tone as cluelessness. Yeah, little sis, a real player, Alex taunted. The kind of company you only read about in magazines. My father chuckled, clearly enjoying their pile-on, certain that my silence meant surrender. But behind my calm exterior, my mind was racing, replaying every step I'd taken to get to this moment. I'd always known my father would sell eventually. He was too obsessed with legacy and too blind to see the shifting landscape of our industry. What he never suspected was that I'd been quietly preparing for this very outcome, building something all my own, right under his nose. For years, I'd studied his every move, learned from his mistakes, and made note of every deal and handshake. He thought he was teaching me to accept defeat, but all he'd done was teach me how to play the long game. And now, as I sat at that table with everyone expecting me to fall apart, I realized the power was about to shift in a way none of them could possibly imagine. My father leaned back in his chair with a look of smug accomplishment, swirling his wine as if to toast his own cunning. Atlas Consortium is the real deal, he declared for everyone's benefit. Not just some corporate raider, but a group with real vision. They know what this company's worth. He glanced around the table, his pride unmistakable, as if expecting applause. My siblings were already giddy with the possibilities. Alex whispered something about condos in Miami. Becca mused aloud about early retirement, and the rest of the family watched, some envious, others merely awed by the sudden windfall. My father basked in the attention, explaining how he'd negotiated the deal himself, kept it secret for months, and outmaneuvered all the usual suspects. You have to be sharp in business, he said pointedly, eyes flicking to me. Not everyone is cut out for it. The message was clear. He had won, I was irrelevant, and the family legacy was safe in his hands. He outlined the terms with theatrical flourish. $30 million, immediate transfer, non-negotiable. The older relatives nodded approvingly, perhaps relieved that the burden of the business would finally be lifted. The atmosphere was charged, almost celebratory, except for the undercurrent of humiliation directed solely at me. My siblings raised their glasses in mock salute, enjoying the spectacle. I simply smiled, my silence misread as acceptance. My father went on about Atlas Consortium, how they'd been courting the family for months, how he'd played hardball with their CEO, how shrewd he had been. They wanted in from the start, he boasted, but I made them work for it. He grinned at Alex and Becca, proud of the lesson he thought he was teaching. Ruthlessness is its own reward. He was so certain that I was defeated, so blinded by his own ego, that he never once stopped to ask how I was really taking all this in. In that moment, I saw clearly just how little he understood me, or the world he thought he'd mastered. The table buzzed with excitement, a feast of shallow triumph and greedy anticipation, and I watched the whole scene unfold with the calm detachment of someone who already knew the ending. My siblings' laughter grew louder, their jokes sharper, as they discussed all the things they would finally do now that I was out of their hair for good. My father's voice rose above the clamor. This is how dynasties are built, he announced, not by clinging to sentiment but by making tough choices. He looked at me one last time as if daring me to argue, but I only met his gaze and nodded, the smallest hint of a smile playing at the corners of my mouth. He mistook it for surrender, but in reality, it was the calm before the storm, the moment I'd waited for all my life. Suppressing the urge to laugh outright, I let a silence settle over the table before I spoke, feeling the electricity of anticipation build within me. I could sense my siblings' curiosity morphing into confusion, my father's self-assuredness teetering as he searched my face for a reaction he could understand. I took a slow breath, my heart pounding with the thrill of revelation, then placed my hands gently on the table, commanding their attention without raising my voice. "Dad, everyone," I began, my tone almost conversational, "I think there's something you should know about Atlas Consortium before you start counting your shares." I let my words hang in the air, savoring the way every conversation stopped, forks and knives frozen mid-bite as the entire room turned to me. I glanced at my father, saw the flicker of annoyance in his eyes. He hated not being in control, hated surprises even more. "Atlas Consortium isn't just some faceless corporation," I continued, my voice steady and sure. "It's a company with a founder, someone who knows this business inside and out." My siblings exchanged glances, impatient and dismissive, but I pressed on, the confidence in my chest swelling with every word. "What you don't realize," I said, looking directly at my father, "is that I started Atlas Consortium. It's mine." The effect was immediate. Shock radiated through the room like a tidal wave. My father's jaw dropped, his face flushing with disbelief, and for the first time all night, Alex and Becca were rendered utterly speechless. Their smirks dissolved, replaced by open-mouthed astonishment as they struggled to process what I had just said. The rest of the family sat in stunned silence, waiting for someone to tell them it was a joke, but I only smiled, savoring the weight of the moment. My father tried to recover, blustering about lawyers and contracts, but the truth was unassailable. "You think you're clever?" he spat. But I shook my head, my voice calm. "No, just prepared. I saw this coming years ago. While you were busy dismissing me, I built something you never bothered to notice." I explained in broad strokes how Atlas Consortium had quietly acquired stake after stake in the industry, buying up competitors, building a reputation for aggressive but ethical leadership, all under the radar, while my father remained convinced I was just making myself useful. My siblings tried to interrupt, but the evidence was irrefutable. The paperwork, the signatures, the legal structures that shielded my identity until the right moment. "You sold Everhart and Sons," I concluded, "to me. And now, everything you tried so hard to keep from me is mine, fair and square." My father's pride gave way to a stunned, hollow silence. My siblings could only stare as their dreams of easy riches evaporated. I sat back, finally at peace, knowing the game was over, and that, against all odds, I had won on my own terms. The silence that followed my revelation was unlike anything I'd ever experienced in our house, total, heavy, almost sacred in its finality. For once, neither Alex nor Becca had a snarky retort. My father's bravado had collapsed, replaced by a shell-shocked disbelief that left him speechless. I watched as his hands trembled, the wine glass forgotten, his eyes darting around the table as if hoping someone would contradict me, rescue him from the truth. My siblings' faces twisted from confusion to denial, then to panic as the realization hit them that the deal they'd been celebrating was actually a surrender, that the very person they'd always dismissed now held the keys to the kingdom. Alex sputtered, searching for some loophole. "There's no way. This isn't possible. You're not capable." But even he could hear the hollowness in his own voice. Becca stared at me as if seeing a stranger, her mouth working soundlessly, the gears in her mind spinning, failing to find an angle to exploit. The rest of the family, who had so enjoyed the spectacle of my humiliation just minutes before, now seemed paralyzed, unsure whether to offer condolences or beg for favor. My father tried to regain control, his words clumsy and brittle. "You tricked us. You manipulated." But I cut him off with a shake of my head, my voice gentle but unyielding. "No tricks, Dad. Just business. The same way you always taught us." The irony wasn't lost on anyone. He'd spent a lifetime lecturing us on the importance of strategy and vigilance, yet he'd never thought to watch the quietest one in the room. Their shock deepened as I laid out briefly the timeline. Years of quiet effort, assembling a team, identifying the company's weaknesses, planning each move while everyone was too busy underestimating me to notice. I explained how I'd made Atlas Consortium a haven for talent overlooked by companies like his, how I deliberately courted the very people he had dismissed, building something greater in the process. Alex, voice cracking, demanded, "So what? You're the boss now?" The reality was almost too much for them to comprehend, that all their celebrations, their mockery, had been nothing more than a prelude to their own downfall. My father tried to stand, bristling with indignation, but the old authority was gone. He looked smaller, diminished, not by the loss of the business, but by the exposure of his own blind spots. The silence dragged on, filled only by the clatter of silverware as someone finally found the courage to move, the echo of a family legacy rewritten in a single evening. There was no going back, no clever words to undo what had just happened. I could see in that moment that the balance of power had shifted forever, not just in the company, but in the family itself. I had become the force they never saw coming, and for the first time, they were forced to look at me, not as the disappointment, not as the outsider, but as the architect of their new reality. In the stunned silence that followed, I took a deep breath and decided to give them the story they never cared to ask about, the story of how Atlas Consortium came to be, and how every slight, every moment of being ignored had quietly shaped me into the leader they never expected. I began by describing those early days after college, when it was clear I'd never get a real seat at Everhart & Sons, no matter how hard I worked or how many weekends I gave up. Instead of begging for scraps, I'd found a job at a small, struggling tech consultancy, learning everything I could about operational strategy and digital transformation, skills that my father's generation dismissed as fads, but that I knew would become the backbone of modern business. I stayed late, said yes to every challenge, and built relationships with mentors who valued talent over ego. It wasn't glamorous, and there were plenty of nights I wondered if I'd made a mistake. But with every lesson, every tiny win, my confidence grew. Over time, I realized how many talented people out there were just like me, overlooked, underestimated, hungry to prove themselves. When the timing was right, I founded Atlas Consortium not with bombast, but with quiet resolve, gathering together a team of outsiders and underdogs who brought fresh ideas and loyalty born of shared struggle. We started small, consulting contracts, then tech partnerships, then quiet acquisitions of small firms my father's company considered beneath notice. We didn't brag or advertise, we just did the work, slowly building a reputation for reliability, innovation, and, most importantly, integrity. Every deal my father passed on, every promising person he let walk out the door, became an opportunity for Atlas to grow. I invested in people, not just profits, and made sure my company's culture was everything Everhart & Sons wasn't: inclusive, forward-thinking, and relentlessly supportive of those with something to prove. It took years, but eventually the dominoes began to fall. Our client list grew, our influence expanded, and suddenly, Atlas Consortium was being talked about in boardrooms and business schools as a model for the new era. When I learned through the grapevine that Everhart & Sons was looking for buyers, I knew the moment had come. I set the plan in motion, carefully concealing my involvement behind layers of legal structures and trusted proxies, not out of malice, but because I wanted the deal to be made on merit, not legacy. I wanted my father to see what real leadership looked like, to realize too late that the child he dismissed had outpaced him in every way that mattered. As I finished recounting the journey, I watched the understanding dawn on my siblings' faces, saw the grudging respect begin to edge out the disbelief. For the first time, they saw me as more than an obstacle, more than a scapegoat. My father was silent, staring at the table, his pride bruised beyond repair. I knew I hadn't just taken over the company. I'd reclaimed my own story, and nothing would ever be the same. With the truth finally out, it was time to address the practical aftermath. What would become of Everhart & Sons, and what, if anything, my family's place in it would be. The room remained tense, brittle with wounded egos and dawning realization. But now every eye was fixed on me, not with mockery, but with apprehension. I let the silence stretch just long enough for everyone to understand that the balance of power had truly shifted. Then I straightened in my seat, my tone calm and measured as I explained how things would proceed. "The sale will go through, as agreed," I said, making it clear that I had no intention of rescinding the deal. "The terms are legally binding, and I will honor them to the letter. But there will be a few amendments to the transition. Some expectations you should be aware of." My father bristled, opening his mouth to object, but the fight had gone out of him. He could only muster a weak protest. "You can contest it if you want, Dad. But the contracts are ironclad and your lawyers signed off on every page." Alex's face twisted with frustration, Becca's with disbelief, but I pressed on, outlining the new structure. Legacy executive positions would be phased out over 6 months, generous severance packages provided to all loyal longtime employees, and most critically, no member of the family would be given a ceremonial role just for the sake of tradition. "Positions will be based on merit and performance, nothing more," I stated, locking eyes with my siblings so they'd know I meant it. "If you want to stay, you'll interview for your jobs alongside everyone else." The room erupted into a new kind of chaos. Questions, objections, desperate appeals to sentiment and history, but I remained unmoved. "This isn't personal," I said, though part of me knew it absolutely was. "It's about what's best for the business, and for the people who make it run." Some of the older relatives tried to intervene, appealing to nostalgia, warning that I was destroying the family's legacy. I explained without malice that the real legacy had been eroded long ago by favoritism, arrogance, and short-sightedness. My goal was to rebuild, to create something worthy of the name, not just for our family, but for everyone who had ever been overlooked or underappreciated. The poetic justice was undeniable. The company my father tried so hard to keep out of my reach would now be defined by the very qualities he had dismissed: resilience, inclusivity, and vision. My siblings, seeing their golden tickets evaporate, grew sullen, struggling to accept that the rules had changed for good. My father, defeated, looked smaller than I'd ever seen him, unable to argue with the results of the game he'd always claimed to master. The moment was bittersweet. My revenge was real, but so was my responsibility. I knew the months ahead would be hard, but for the first time in my life, the company and my destiny were truly in my hands. As the last echoes of protest faded and the reality of the new order set in, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me, something deeper than satisfaction, a kind of closure that had eluded me my entire life. The company that had once been the battleground for all my father's expectations and my siblings' ambitions was finally mine, not through inheritance or favoritism, but through sheer will and vision. I looked around the table, seeing not adversaries, but people trapped by their own limited ideas of power and worth. My father sat slumped, not just defeated, but forced to confront the consequences of a lifetime spent underestimating others. Alex and Becca, still reeling, struggled to accept a world where merit, not birth order or bravado, decided their future. For a moment, I allowed myself to grieve, not for the family business as it was, but for the years lost chasing validation from people who never truly saw me. Yet even in that sadness, there was a profound sense of relief. I spoke softly, addressing the entire room. "It's time to build something better. The old ways weren't working. Not for me, not for any of us. If you want to be part of the future, you'll have to earn your place, just like everyone else." There was no more need for vengeance. The justice had already been served, not through cruelty or destruction, but through transformation. I knew the road ahead would not be easy. There would be resistance, old wounds reopened, and plenty of hard decisions. But I also knew that I had finally stepped out of the shadows, claiming the right to define myself and my legacy on my own terms. In the weeks that followed, I focused on earning the trust of those who had been ignored for too long, bringing new life to the company's culture, and investing in people who valued integrity and innovation. Word spread quickly, both inside and outside the industry. And while some doubted my resolve, more and more began to see that the quiet one in the family had always been the one worth betting on. My siblings slowly adjusted, some with resentment, others with grudging respect. And even my father, in rare moments of honesty, admitted that he'd never seen me so sure of myself. Thanksgiving came and went, but the meaning of family changed for me forever. The lesson was simple and devastating. The greatest power lies not in the ability to control or exclude, but in the courage to forge your own path, even when no one believes in you. In reclaiming my story, I found a freedom I never knew was possible, and a legacy truly worth leaving behind.